This episode is brought to you by Progressive Commercial Insurance. Business owners, meet Progressive Insurance. They make it easy to get discounts on commercial auto insurance and find coverages to grow with your business. Quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Coverage provided and serviced by affiliated and third-party insurers. Discounts and coverage selections not available in all states or situations.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Support for Ben Franklin's World comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, proud citizens of vast early America, and the primary partners in the Georgian Papers program. The Georgian Papers program aims to digitize, interpret, and make available an extraordinarily rich collection of correspondence, maps, and royal household ledgers created by the Georgian kings of England and their families. This program is really big because it seeks to make available its approximately 350,000 items to the world. Digital access to this collection promises to really change our understanding of the Georgian period and of 18th and early 19th century North America. Now, as part of its contribution to this program, the Omohundro Institute is sending scholars to Windsor Castle, where they work alongside royal archivists as they seek to gain greater insight into these rich materials. Curious about what these scholars are finding in the Georgian Papers? Suzanne Schwartz, a professor of history at the University of Worcester in England, related that her trip to the Royal Archives provided an invaluable opportunity to trace how leading members of the British royal family and household responded to debates about slavery, Africa, and abolition in the aftermath of American independence. She noted that the Georgian Papers reveal a large increase in the royal family's references to the Atlantic slave trade, West Africa, slavery, and to West Indian civil and military affairs. She mentioned that her findings provide clear evidence that the Georgians were diverse in their interests and that their papers have the potential to expand what we know about slavery and abolition. Soon, you'll be able to investigate the papers Schwartz had a chance to look at, because thanks to the Omohundro Institute, royal archivists are digitizing these materials so that anyone who has an interest in them can explore them too. For more information about the Georgian Papers program and the Omohundro Institute's support of it, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Georgian Papers.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 143 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. How did the framers draft the Constitution of 1787? What powers does a constitution give the federal government? Why do we elect the President of the United States by an electoral system rather than by popular vote? Since November 2016, you've sent me a lot of questions about the Constitution and how it works. And you were right to send me these questions because we really haven't had an episode that explores the history of the Constitution and how it came to be. So today, we're going to work on changing that. Michael Klarman, a professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School and the author of The Founders' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution, joins us to discuss the United States Constitution and how and why the framers drafted it. Our exploration of the Constitution will reveal the state of American governance just after the War for Independence, what caused the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to meet and discuss a new form of government, and what issues the delegates debated and compromised on in order to create the Constitution of 1787. But first, just a reminder that our meetup in Philadelphia will take place this coming Saturday on July 22nd at 4:30 p.m. at the Black Sheep Pub on South 17th Street. Please let me know if you plan on attending. You can do this by emailing me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or by posting a comment in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. This way, I know how many to expect and I'll be able to keep an eye out for you. Okay, Ready to dive into the history of the United States Constitution? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He's a specialist in constitutional law and the history of the United States Constitution, and he's published 5 books, including the Bancroft Prize-winning From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, The Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equality, and his newest book, The Founders' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution, which was nominated for the 2017 George Washington Book Prize. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Michael Klarman.
Thanks very much for having me.
Mike, we're so glad you could join us because we have lots of questions about the Constitution and how it was drafted. In fact, of late, questions related to the Constitution have become the most popular listener-requested topic for this show.
Yeah, there's a lot of constitutional law happening all around us all the time these days.
Well, I guess we should begin exploring this topic by talking about how the Constitutional Convention of 1787 came about. Mike, would you tell us what caused the delegates from 13 states to meet in Philadelphia in May 1787?
Sure. So let me talk about 2 different things. One is the substance of what was perceived not to be working, which was what led to Philadelphia. And then second is the actual path to the convention. So before the Constitution, the country was governed for about a decade by the Articles of Confederation. And it was widely appreciated that the Articles were not working out that well. Congress had been given the power to fight the Revolutionary War, but it hadn't been given many of the powers that any sovereign government would need. So, for example, Congress didn't have a taxing power. It could requisition money from the states, but the states might choose not to comply with the requisitions. Congress had no power to regulate commerce. That was a problem because foreign nations like Great Britain and France would discriminate against American trade, and that would really call for the United States to reciprocate, but the United States didn't have any power to pass, for example, discriminatory trade restrictions. And then there was really no power within Congress to implement even those decisions that were within Congress's authority to take. So Congress clearly had the power to pass treaties, to negotiate treaties, but it couldn't do anything if states decided not to comply with particular treaty provisions that they disagreed with. So those were kind of the flaws in the Articles. Now, there was also a crisis developing in the states over economic policy, and historians disagree some about whether we ought to be focusing more about the absence of power at the national level or what was going on in the states with regard to fiscal and monetary policy. So that's the substance of what led to the convention. The actual path was the Virginia legislature had actually proposed very early in 1786 that the states send delegates to Annapolis where they would convene to discuss commercial problems and try to come up with some solution. The states mostly didn't show up in Annapolis. 5 states went to Annapolis, 12 delegates, and that wasn't enough to get anything done. So the delegates, who included Madison and Hamilton, they decided to make a bold decision, and they decided to send out a call to the states to meet at another convention in Philadelphia in May of 1787. Now, it wasn't clear whether states were going to comply with that request any more than they had complied with the request to go to Annapolis. One thing that happened is Shays' Rebellion, which was a revolt by debtor farmers in Massachusetts who were tired of being asked to pay high taxes that they couldn't pay and resulting in bankruptcies. They were losing their farms. They decided to close down the civil courts in Massachusetts so that this wouldn't happen. Shays' Rebellion convinced some states that were initially disinclined to go to Philadelphia to send delegates. It convinced Congress that it ought to get behind the Philadelphia Convention as well. It convinced George Washington that he ought to accept the invitation of the Virginia legislature to show up at the Philadelphia Convention to represent Virginia. So that was a pretty important event in producing the Philadelphia Convention, and they did. The states showed up there with their delegates in May of 1787.
Wow. There was a lot going on in the 1780s. And I think what's most striking is no power to tax, no power to enforce international treaties. It sounds like the Articles of Confederation gave the states all the governing power. Would you tell us more about the Articles of Confederation and how the states came to hold so much power under this first United States Constitution?
Right. So when the states decided that they were going to depart from the British Empire, they sent delegates to Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress declared independence in 1776, and the states were requested by Congress to write new constitutions. Continental Congress finally got around to writing a governing document, But the Articles of Confederation were mostly like a treaty among sovereign states. It's like creating a United Nations. The states were creating a government that could run the war, and it was given powers to run the war. It had the authority to declare war. It had the authority to print money to finance the war. It had the authority to borrow money. It had the authority to negotiate treaties. It had the authority to appoint a general. But it didn't have a lot of the powers that you would think a sovereign government would have. It didn't necessarily have the powers that the state governments had. So rather than be giving a taxing authority, which would allow the national government to reach into the states and tax individuals, it was simply given the authority to requisition funds from the states. Again, that's sort of like the UN. The United Nations doesn't have authority to tax Americans. It can ask the member nations to pay their requisitions, and if they don't pay, there's nothing the UN can do. And that was the same thing with the Confederation Congress. It asked states to pay their requisitions, and if they didn't, nothing it could do. It also didn't have the power to regulate commerce. So after the Revolutionary War, the United States is no longer part of the British Empire. If Great Britain can get goods from within the empire, it's not interested in importing them from the United States anymore. For example, it's not going to buy codfish from the New England states. It's going to get them from Canada, which is still part of the British Empire. It's not going to allow American ships to carry goods between the United States and Europe. It's going to carry those goods on its own ships. And the natural response when another nation discriminates against your trade is you discriminate against their trade. But the United States didn't have that power. Individual states could decide that they were going to impose discriminatory tariff barriers on the British. But then there's a big collective action problem because the states, in some sense, are in competition with each other. So without Congress having that authority, it's really not going to be possible to effectively respond to British trade discrimination. And then also, there is no federal court system under the Articles of Confederation. There's no executive. There's just a legislature. There's just Congress. So as I said earlier, if Congress is negotiating a treaty, that treaty may be unpopular in particular parts of the United States. In those states, they may decide to obstruct the treaty. There's nothing Congress can do about that. There's no federal court system to interpret the treaty. There's no federal executive to try to implement the treaty. And that's a real problem because no other nation is going to take treaties with the United States very seriously if the United States can't be compelled to comply with its obligations undertaken in the treaties. So it's mainly a problem of the states are very reluctant to acquiesce in a national government exerting authority. They just fought a war against a distant government back in London that was taxing them without representation. And in an era of very primitive transportation and communication, the national government of the United States is also a distant government, and they're not going to give it the authority to tax them without their consent and so forth.
Did the Articles of Confederation have any provision for how Congress or the people could amend its provisions? To make some of the Constitution's weaker provisions stronger? And if it did have an amendment procedure, why didn't the men who gathered at the Constitutional Convention just work to revise the Articles of Confederation?
So the Articles do provide for their amendment. They provide in the last of the Articles, Article 13, that unanimity is required. The state legislatures have to unanimously acquiesce in any amendment that's proposed by Congress for it to become part of the Articles. Twice there had been proposals to amend the Articles to give Congress a limited form of taxing power. Each time, one state declined to go along. First, it was Rhode Island. The second time, it was New York. But there were no amendments under the Articles that received the unanimity required for implementation. The Philadelphia Convention was called specifically to propose changes that would revise the Articles in order to make the national government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. The delegates in Philadelphia decided pretty much from day one that they were going to ignore any instructions they'd been given that would limit their authority, and they decided pretty much to scrap the Articles. What most people anticipated was that the Philadelphia Convention would propose some changes, some mildly nationalizing changes like a taxing power to Congress, giving Congress a commerce power. Most people also anticipated, because this has been explicit in the call for the Philadelphia Convention that was made by the Annapolis Convention, and it was explicit in Congress's resolution approving the convention, that anything proposed by the Philadelphia Convention would have to go first to Congress for approval, and then it would have to be ratified by all 13 of the state legislatures. So what they did in Philadelphia was, from day one, they ignored their call to revise the Articles, and they decided to scrap the Articles and create a genuinely national government. And they wrote a provision in the new constitution they were proposing that directed that once 9 states had ratified, that would be sufficient to put the Constitution into operation. So they eliminated the unanimity requirement. They were quite deceptive because everybody had been assuming that whatever the Philadelphia Convention proposed would have to go before all 13 states for their unanimous agreement. And they provided instead, no, 9 states can approve this. Now, they can only bind themselves, but once those 9 states have approved, the Constitution will go into operation. And that turns out to be really critical because if they'd needed unanimity, there's essentially no chance that what they proposed in Philadelphia would have been unanimously approved. It's only because they wrote this Article 7, providing for 9 states being sufficient. That's the only reason the Constitution was approved.
Now, earlier you mentioned Shays' Rebellion and how the attempt to pass debt and tax relief measures to help people get through the economic depression of the Confederation period proved problematic and helped lead to the Constitutional Convention. Would you tell us more about the tax and debt relief measures that Americans saw after the Revolution and why these measures caused a rebellion in Massachusetts?
It's important to start with a description of the economic situation, the economic crisis confronting the country after the Revolutionary War. It's not unusual after wartime for the economy to go into recession. For one thing, there's much reduced demand in the economy. You had 2 very large armies in the field consuming food, purchasing clothing, purchasing war material, and now that sort of artificially stimulated demand is no longer in the economy. There was a tremendous amount of property destruction during the Revolutionary War. In the southern states, tens of thousands of slaves had liberated themselves. That was a massive destruction of what white Southerners regarded as their wealth. Trade with Europe was drastically curtailed now that the United States is out of the British Empire, as we were discussing earlier. For example, American ship makers in New England are no longer going to be able to sell their ships because European countries aren't buying them. So a severely constrained economy. Historians have speculated maybe the worst economic situation other than during the Great Depression. And at the same time, they have to pay off the war debt. $70 or $80 million is owed to foreign governments and to domestic creditors who loan the federal government money. So think of soldiers who are paid in certificates, but those certificates are not being redeemed, and the federal government owes them money for their military service, but they're not being paid. So the states are now imposing higher taxes to pay off the war debt. So you have this situation where the economy is tanking, but you're raising taxes to pay off the war debt. Most modern economists since Keynes would say that's a disaster. You don't enact tighter fiscal policy at a time of economic collapse. The farmers are often being asked to pay not only higher taxes, but to pay in gold and silver, because to pay off the foreign debt, you have to do it in gold and silver because that's what was loaned to you. And yet almost all the hard currency has fled into either private hands where it's being locked up for fear that states are going to issue paper currency and people will lend gold and silver but then be paid back in valueless paper, or it's fled to Europe. So people have estimated, as little as 20% of the gold and silver that had been in circulation before the war is now available. So you're asking people to pay higher taxes and hard currency that doesn't exist at a time of severe economic collapse, and the farmers are at risk of bankruptcy. They have some wealth, but it's in their land and they can't monetize it. So what they want is for the state governments to loan them money, basically give them paper with their land as collateral. They'll pay interest on the paper, and maybe they'll be allowed to pay their taxes with the paper so they can pay their tax obligations but not have their property foreclosed upon. Now, they're also asking for more direct forms of relief. They're asking for laws that would allow debts to be repaid in installments. Even if the terms of the contract say you pay a certain sum on a certain date, they're saying give us the ability to pay it back in installments or allow us to pay it in kind rather than in cash. So, we won't pay our taxes in gold and silver. We'll pay them in tobacco in Virginia, for example. Now, the last thing to add to this is the war debt is being bought up by speculators. So a lot of this might have been certificates paid to soldiers, but at a time that they needed money, they would sell it at 10 cents on the dollar. They'd sell these certificates to speculators. So the war debt is now being combined into fewer and fewer hands, literally in the whole country, probably just several hundred people. So you're raising taxes on farmers, and it's for the benefit of wealthy speculators who scooped up the debt at 10 cents on the dollar. And people think this isn't fair, and they're demanding that state legislatures give them relief. And because most of the state constitutions were fairly democratic, the legislatures are mostly providing the relief that the farmers are demanding. In Massachusetts, they don't. So in Massachusetts, you've got one of the least democratically accountable state governments. It's actually increasing taxes in 1786. And finally, that just leads to an explosion because thousands of farmers are not going to tolerate losing their land. So they march and they shut down the civil courts because they're trying to prevent foreclosures. And that sort of illustrates what happens in one of the states that resists relief legislation. A majority of the states actually pass relief legislation, but in Massachusetts they don't, and it explodes into a debtor rebellion. And the framers, these sort of elite Federalists, people like Madison, Washington, Hamilton, they're appalled both at the relief legislation that state legislatures are passing, which they see as just officially sanctioned theft, and they're even more appalled at the idea of ordinary farmers taking the law into their own hands and shutting down the civil courts.
The post-revolution economy was troubled. The Articles of Confederation proved weak and incapable of fixing the economy. And the 13 states, well, they were all acting autonomously. These were the conditions that called for the Constitutional Convention, which convened on May 25, 1787 in Philadelphia. Mike, would you tell us about the Constitutional Convention and what precisely the delegates set out to achieve?
So some of them had different ideas about what they ought to be doing. So there's some delegates, for example, two of the New York delegates, Yates and Lansing, they think that we're here in Philadelphia to give Congress a couple of additional powers, but not to make any fundamental changes in the way the Articles work. Madison, who's one of the delegates from Virginia, and it turns out a very critical delegate because Madison was the one who was planning in advance. Madison was studying the history of confederacies, ancient and modern, and why they failed. Madison was coming up with a plan to remedy what he had diagnosed the problems to be. Madison wanted much bolder reform. He and Washington were exchanging letters before the convention, and they agreed among themselves, we should not be pursuing what they called temporizing expedients. We should be pursuing the best form of government that we think it's possible to obtain. This may be our unique opportunity to achieve it. So Madison's agenda is not just to give Congress a taxing power, not just to give it a commerce power, but also to fundamentally restructure the government. So we're going to create a true national government, not just one branch of a legislature. We're going to create an executive. We're going to create a judiciary. He wants proportional representation in both houses, meaning that you're going to radically deviate from the Articles where every state delegation got the same equal vote. Doesn't matter if you're enormous Virginia or tiny Delaware. Under the Articles, you have the same political power. Madison wants proportional representation. So mighty Virginia is going to dominate both houses of the national government. He wants the national government, amazingly, to be able to veto any state legislation. That's something we've never had in our history, and something that was too nationalist, even for what proved to be a fairly nationalist bunch of delegates. So expand the power of the national government, taxing power, military power, commerce power, an effective method of ensuring federal supremacy. That means creating a federal court system. There was nothing like that under the Articles. Creating an executive. There was no executive under the Articles. They're going to create a unitary executive with lots of power, somebody who can give energy and dynamism to the national government. And they're going to make sure that the larger states have clout proportionate to their population, which Madison thinks is essential if you want the large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts to delegate lots of their power to the national government. You're going to have to give them power proportionate to their wealth and population. So that's the agenda for somebody like Madison, Washington, Hamilton. That's not the agenda for some of the other delegates who complain almost from the outset, this is illegitimate. You're departing from your instructions. This is not what the American public thought was going to happen. And we protest that. And some of them actually walked out because they thought that was the most effective way to try to delegitimize what was going on in Philadelphia. Madison didn't get everything he wanted. So Madison was actually a little bit depressed after the convention because he lost on some big issues, but he succeeded in getting them to reject the Articles, to create a genuinely national government that could operate on individuals rather than simply on the states, creating a government with separated powers, a president, a legislature, a court system, and giving the national government supremacy and the ability to try to effectuate its will vis-a-vis the states.
If Madison went into the Constitutional Convention with a plan, did he happen to coordinate with anyone to effect his plan, like Hamilton or Washington?
Madison was exchanging ideas with the people he was closest to. That's basically Jefferson, his mentor, who is off in Paris, Edmund Randolph, who's the governor of Virginia, and George Washington, who's another patron for Madison. Madison's about 20 years younger than Washington. So he's exchanging correspondence. Madison's the only one who's systematically thinking through the problems and trying to come up with proposed solutions. And he does get the Virginians to show up early in Philadelphia. Now, I don't think the record proves that he coordinated with all the Virginians, but there's certainly evidence that he got Edmund Randolph, the governor, to show up early. And there's evidence certainly that he knew Washington was going to Philadelphia early for another reason. Washington had another meeting with some Revolutionary War Confederates of his, so he was in Philadelphia early. And the Virginians showed up early. George Mason showed up early as well. So it may be that they were coordinating. They had discussions. George Mason reported that Virginians spent 2 or 3 hours every day while they were waiting for other people to show up. So the other delegates were about 10 or 12 days late, which the Virginians not only showed up a week early, but everybody else was a week or two late, giving them lots of time to coordinate. They could also coordinate with the Pennsylvanians, all of whom were from Philadelphia, so they were already there. So those were actually the 2 largest states, the 2 states that had the most eminent delegations and the 2 states that probably were inclined to think most nationalistically. So they're agreeing among themselves what the operating plan of the convention ought to be. And maybe some of the other delegates are a little bit taken aback by this, the fact that there's already been some coordination among these large state delegates with these very eminent delegates. Maybe they're a little bit taken back, and there's evidence that it took the smaller state delegations a couple weeks to sort of organize among themselves and come up with their counter proposals to the Virginians' proposals.
Yeah, we should talk about these proposals, because when we think back to when we first learned about the Constitutional Convention, we may remember the 3 plans the convention debated: the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and the Connecticut Compromise. Mike, would you refresh our memories about these plans and tell us how they reflected some of the biggest issues the delegates had to debate and resolve?
Sure. So the Virginia Plan, as we've been discussing, is given the name of the Virginians, who are the ones who seem to coordinate on it. It's nationalistic. It's going to give the national government extremely broad power. The specific grants of powers are not actually enumerated, but the Virginia Plan provides that Congress will have authority to do everything that the states are unable to accomplish on their own. And it ultimately means a virtually unlimited taxing power and unlimited commerce power, very, very broad military powers. The Virginia Plan would cut the states entirely out of the process of picking the national government. So the people would elect the House would elect the Senate and the Senate together would elect the president. That's a huge departure from the Articles, where the only branch of the national government is Congress, and Congress is selected by state legislatures. So they're going to go from the state governments entirely constituting the national government to the states playing no role in constituting the national government. Other key provision is proportional representation in both houses of Congress. That's an enormous departure from the Articles. Again, under the Articles, there's just one house of a legislature, and they don't have proportional representation based on population, but rather every state has the same equal vote. As I said, that's an effort to induce the larger states to be willing to grant broad powers to the national government. Now, the smaller states like Delaware, New Jersey, New York actually was one of the smaller states at the time. They then coordinate among themselves, and they propose something that's going to be more of a revision of the Articles. The first provision and the first resolution of the Virginia Plan talks explicitly about revising the Articles, which is an implicit rebuke of the Virginia Plan, which is scrapping the Articles. The New Jersey Plan is going to apportion representation equally in a single house of the national legislature. So it's sticking with that critical provision in the Articles, which of course is what small states want. They want as much power as they can get. Congress is given some taxing power, but not the virtually unlimited power it has to tax under the Constitution. The New Jersey Plan does provide for federal supremacy in the same way the Constitution does, but also it limits that federal supremacy. There's going to be a Supreme Court, but there's not going to be a system of lower courts, whereas the Constitution does envision the possibility of Congress creating lower courts. So there'll be a plural executive under the New Jersey Plan. So there will be an executive, unlike under the Articles, but it's not going to be a unitary executive. It's not going to be a single figure as president. Rather, it's going to be a kind of council with every state having representation. So that will obviously be a less powerful executive because it's plural rather than unitary. And the Connecticut Compromise is not really a third plan, but rather it's a way to reconcile these two other plans. And basically, the Connecticut Compromise says the large states will get what they want in the House, representation apportioned according to population. The small states will get what they want in the other House, the Senate. Every state will count for one. And that's a proposal to keep the convention together when the small states are threatening to tear it apart because they're absolutely insistent if they don't get equal representation, they're walking out of the convention. And the Connecticut delegates, they proposed this compromise. For a month or 6 weeks, the delegates are fighting over this. It really does look like the convention is going to end in disarray. Washington is writing a letter to Hamilton, who's gone home to New York, saying, I'm sort of sorry I ever came because the whole thing is going to turn into a flop. But eventually, the Connecticut Compromise was approved, although very narrowly, and the large states were resentful. But the small states played an effective game of poker, and they threatened to walk home, take their marbles with them, and the large states caved in the end, and that's what held the convention together.
It really sounds like the issue of representation was one of the biggest and most divisive issues of the convention. Would you tell us how the delegates hammered out this issue and reached a consensus on it?
Well, Madison had predicted in his correspondence, and this largely proved true for the first month or 6 weeks of the convention, Madison had predicted that there would be a majority in favor of proportional representation in both houses. His prediction, it's a little bit unconventional. So, first of all, not every state was represented in Philadelphia. Rhode Island didn't send delegates, and New Hampshire didn't send its delegates until late July because the state didn't have money to pay them. So there are 11 states that are going to be represented either from the beginning or from within the first couple of weeks. Madison predicted that 6 states would support proportional representation in the legislature, both houses. Those were the 3 largest states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and the 3 southernmost states, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Now, those were not the largest states at the time, but everybody in 1787 was predicting that population was going to move over time to the Southwest, and that meant that those states in the Deep South would become much more populous. So Madison's prediction was the largest states would vote for proportional representation for obvious reasons, and the 3 southernmost states would vote for it because they were expecting to become large. And that's exactly what happened. The split was 6-5 in favor of proportionality when they first voted on this. And it stuck that way through much of June. But then what happened is a couple of Georgia delegates left to go attend Congress in New York. That led to Georgia's vote not counting because it only had 2 delegates left and they were divided. Then there were some other shifts over time, the details of which I don't even remember. And they ended up getting a very narrow majority in the opposite direction. But some of it was because even though when the vote had been 6-5 in favor of proportionality in both houses, everybody sort of understood that you couldn't jam this down the throat of the small state, that they were just going to say, look, we're not agreeing to this. We're leaving. We're going to walk out of Philadelphia. We're not going to ratify the Constitution. And obviously 6 states can't create a new union. So they knew they were going to have to make some concessions. A lot of the large states resisted. This isn't something that, Madison was depressed about this. Hamilton said, this is outrageous. You're just extorting this. You don't really deserve equal representation, right? Virginia has 12 times the population of Delaware. Why should a Delaware resident get 12 times the voting power of a Virginian in the United States Senate? And the small states tried to make principal arguments. They didn't want to just do this as a power grab. They said, look, we believe in state sovereignty, and every state ought to count equally because the states are sovereign, just like in the United Nations today. In the General Assembly, every nation gets one vote, and it doesn't depend whether you're enormous China or tiny Liechtenstein, you get the same vote in the General Assembly. The small states also said, look, the large states are going to dominate us. They're going to get together. They're going to gang up on us. All our rights are going to be interfered with. And the large staters responded. They said, look, we don't have state sovereignty. We have popular sovereignty. The people are represented. And they said, the large states aren't going to gang up on you. The large states don't have anything in common with each other. Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, they come from different parts of the country. They have different economies. They have different religious traditions. They have nothing in common with one another. So why do you think they're going to gang up on you? And I don't think many people were persuaded. They made these arguments back and forth for weeks. I don't think anybody was really persuaded by the arguments. It's just that the small states, at the end of the day, were able to say, give us what we want, or we're walking out. We're making what we think is a concession. You can have your proportional representation in the House, but if you don't give us what we already have under the Articles, which is equality of representation, if you don't give us that in the Senate, then forget it. We're not going along with this. And at the end of the day, that worked. And we have the same thing today, right? Every state has equal representation in the Senate, and the disparities in population have gotten even worse, and you're stuck with them.
How did slavery factor into these debates about proportional representation in the Constitution? Because slaves were a big part of states' populations, and yet they were also property.
So this is obviously something that Northerners and Southerners are going to disagree about. The North does have slavery, but by the time of the Philadelphia Convention, it's pretty much on the road to extinction in the North. So probably the largest slave population of any northern state is maybe 6 to 8%. That would be about the slave population of New Jersey or New York in 1787. By contrast, in a southern state like South Carolina, slaves are about 50% of the population. In Virginia, they're 40%. It's obvious that the Southerners are going to demand that their slaves count for something in apportioning representation in the House, given that altogether in the 5 southern states, that's Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia, slaves are about 40% of the population in those 5 southern states. Also, slaves are an incredibly important part of the wealth of those states. And in 1787, a great many people think that representation should not be based just on population. It should also be based on wealth. So the Southerners are going to demand something. The South Carolinians say slaves should count the same as anyone else. We're not talking about whether someone votes. Women don't vote, but women count for purposes of apportioning population. Children count even though they don't vote. So why shouldn't slaves count? Northerners sometimes say, no, slaves shouldn't count at all. You treat your slaves like property. And a Massachusetts delegate says, we don't count our horses and cows. Why should you count your slaves? I think most of those are bargaining positions. I think people understood that in the end they were going to compromise. 3/5 was the compromise they came up with, that 5 slaves will count the same as 3 free people for purposes of apportioning representation in the House. That was a familiar fraction for them because in 1783, there had been a proposed amendment to the Articles of Confederation, this time in the context of taxation. So the question is, how do you apportion taxes among the states? And if you did it according to population, how would you count slaves? And on this issue, of course, Northerners and Southerners flipped. Northerners now thought, well, of course, slaves should count the same as everyone else in apportioning taxes, and Southerners thought they shouldn't count at all. So they completely flipped their position when the issue was apportioning representation rather than taxes. But they agreed ultimately to 3/5. And one way of sort of making that a slightly more attractive concession to Northerners was to say, well, when we're apportioning direct taxes on land, for example, we're also going to count slaves. When we apportion those taxes among the states according to population, we're going to count those slaves 3/5 for that as well. So Southerners will not only get more representation on account of their slaves, but they'll also have to pay more in taxes.
Now, as the delegates were framing this new government, were there any other debates about slavery? I mean, did any of the delegates look at this convention and its purpose as perhaps an opportunity to abolish slavery?
Nobody in Philadelphia is talking about writing a constitution that would immediately end slavery. There's no chance that the South would join a union that ended slavery tomorrow. Again, 40% of the South's population is enslaved. A very substantial portion of the white Southerners' wealth is in slavery. And you have to remember that the northern states have often not abolished slavery yet. Northerners believe in protecting property rights, so they would have great hesitation in simply immediately emancipating slaves. The northern states that have started to emancipate slaves have done it in an extremely gradual way. So Pennsylvania is the first state to do so in a statute passed in 1780. But that statute actually doesn't free any slaves already in existence. It only says from the date of this statute, slaves who are born after this law is passed, when they reach the age of 28, will become free. That's basically giving the owners 28 years of control over their labor. So even in the North, when they abolish slavery, they do it in this very gradual way. So nobody in Philadelphia is thinking to abolish slavery. They're mostly fighting over how much power Southerners will get as a result of their slaves. because the South is a slave society and the North is a society that only has a few slaves, there are differing economic interests. So the Southerners are mostly producers of agricultural staples, tobacco, rice, indigo. Northerners have a more diversified economy. Northerners, they're involved in the carrying trade. So one way to see it is the South consists of people who support free trade. They import all of their manufactured goods. They export agricultural staples. They'd actually favor a regime of free trade, whereas the Northerners, they actually have some of their own manufacturers, so they might like tariffs to protect Northern manufacturing against foreign competition. Northerners are often the ship owners, the carpenters who build ships, the seamen who sail the ships. And they would like to have a monopoly on shipping between the United States and Europe. They'd like to be able to charge high freight rates protected against European competition. Southern agricultural exporters don't want to pay those monopolist freight rates. So Northerners and Southerners have different economic interests because of their different investments in slavery, which have led to different economies. And for example, that means that Southerners are a little bit leery of a commerce power that Congress might use to benefit Northern shippers. They'd prefer that Congress only be able to pass such legislation by supermajority vote. There's also a big issue in the convention about what to do with the foreign slave trade. A lot of Northerners want to end the foreign slave trade, which they see as even more horrific than slavery. Thousands of slaves are dying in the Atlantic crossing. And in addition, they'd prefer that slavery gradually be wound down. And they don't want Southerners to be increasing their supply of slaves. And they think it's unfair that if Southerners import more slaves, they're simply going to get more political power in Congress as a result of the 3/5 rule. So there's actually a big fight in the Philadelphia Convention, not over ending slavery, but over ending the slave trade. And there's another compromise, which is they're going to give Congress the authority to end the slave trade in 20 years. And that's going to give the Deep South, South Carolina and Georgia, a chance to replenish their stock of slaves because tens of thousands of slaves in those states have liberated themselves as a result of the Revolutionary War. The other states, the northern states and the upper South states like Virginia and Maryland, which already have more slaves than they need and already are profiting by selling them to the Deep South and would prefer to be insulated from competition by the African slave trade, those states agree, we want to end the slave trade. We'll give South Carolina and Georgia another 20 years to import slaves. And at that point, we want Congress to have the authority to shut it down. So they make some deals, and some of them are not very attractive. But South Carolina and Georgia were threatening to walk out of the convention if they didn't get a generation's protection for the foreign slave trade.
You know, we've talked a lot about details, about how the Constitution was supposed to offer a nationalistic government, how the states would be represented in this new government, and how slaves would be counted towards states' representation. But what type of government did the Constitution of 1787 actually provide and offer the United States?
Well, I tend to think of this along two different dimensions. One is they created a much more powerful national government than existed under the Articles. And the other is they created a national government that was significantly constrained from direct popular influence. So a more powerful national government that can operate directly on individuals, it can tax individuals, it can throw individuals in jail if they don't pay their taxes, almost unlimited authority to raise taxes, almost unlimited military powers to raise an army and a navy and to call state militias into federal service, an unlimited authority over commerce, an explicit guarantee of federal supremacy, a federal court system. The Constitution creates a Supreme Court. It authorized Congress to create a lower federal court system. And then a scheme of separated powers at the national government. They're going to create a more powerful national government, but they're going to split up its powers between Congress, a fairly powerful executive relative to what state governors look like, a judiciary, which didn't exist at the federal level under the Articles. But then they're also going to try to take that more powerful national government and make it less responsive to the sort of populist forces that have led to the states passing debtor relief legislation in the mid-1780s. What are those mechanisms? Very long terms in office. The state level, most lower houses had annual elections, but the lower house at the national level is going to have 2-year terms, and they almost agreed initially on 3-year terms. Presidents get 4-year terms. No governor in the nation served terms that long. U.S. senators are going to serve 6-year terms. Madison would have preferred 9 years. Hamilton actually wanted lifetime tenure for senators and presidents. He thought that would be the only way to adequately protect property rights. They're also going to leave out of the federal constitution some mechanisms that enhance democratic accountability. So there's no instruction under the federal constitution. State constitutions would provide that people could instruct their representatives to vote on a certain issue in a certain way, and the representatives would be morally obliged to do so. And if they didn't, they would have to resign from office. There is no provision for recall under the federal constitution, no provision for instruction. Some people who didn't like the Constitution thought senators should be recallable by state legislatures, but the Constitution doesn't provide for that. So they're trying to create a powerful federal government relative to the status quo, but they're also trying to make it relatively impervious to direct accountability because they want the national government not to be subject to being overcome by the sort of populist passions that had led state legislatures to capitulate to demands for relief legislation.
So the Constitution provided for a government that could act directly upon individuals, but one that individuals couldn't act directly upon it. What did early Americans think about this much less democratic form of government?
Country was divided pretty much down the middle on this. So I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, the people do get to play a role in electing the House of Representatives. So they do have some direct popular influence. But even in the House of Representatives, you're going to have 2-year terms in office. You don't have any form of mandatory rotation. You don't have instruction. You don't have recall. And you have a very small House of Representatives, unlike state legislatures, where, for example, in Massachusetts, the lower house of the state legislature was something like 5 times as large as the initial United States Congress was going to be. And again, the reason for that was to make the United States Congress more distant from the people. The idea was if you had a very large constituency, you were going to have very remote accountability of representatives. The country, according to most historians, was kind of divided down the middle. Half the people didn't love the Constitution. Half the people maybe thought it was enough of an improvement that they could go along with it. Probably a lot of the country wanted something in the middle, but the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, were pretty shrewd about not giving people the possibility to opt for intermediate options. The Federalists had a bunch of advantages in the ratifying campaign, and I think that enabled them to get the Constitution ratified without any antecedent amendments, that is, amendments before it went into effect. And these advantages enabled them to win the day, even though this was a fairly anti-populist document. And you may wonder why people were willing to approve a document that would constrain their influence on government. So there was malapportionment in some state ratifying conventions, especially in South Carolina, so that a majority of people did not pick a majority of the delegates. The malapportionment worked in favor of citizens who lived along the East Coast, and they tended to be overwhelmingly supportive of the Constitution. The newspapers were strongly biased in favor of ratification. Subscribers and advertisers, who were the economic engines driving newspapers, those people tended to be overwhelmingly supportive of the Constitution. They would threaten to boycott newspapers if they dared to publish any Federalists, those are the opponents of the Constitution, to publish their literature. Many conventions, ratifying conventions, were held in eastern cities where support for the Constitution was almost universal across class lines. In most states, the elite, the well-educated, well-born, fairly affluent citizens tended to support the Constitution. So the Federalists had a lot of built-in advantages. It was not entirely a level playing field, and they really did kind of capitalize on those advantages. It's not clear that a majority of the country actually did want the Constitution, and a lot of people would have favored a kind of intermediate solution, and they never really got the opportunity to express their opinion about that.
Why did the framers fear the direct influence of the people on the national government? I mean, one of the areas I think we see a lot of fear is in the people's ability to directly elect the president, which is why the framers created the Electoral College. And as we've seen in the elections of both 2000 and 2016, the electoral system allows a president who didn't win the people's majority vote to win the presidency. So, would you tell us why the framers created the electoral system?
Right. It's a very odd system we have, and it came about largely by accident, and it's probably hard to provide a very strong justification for it today. If you win the most votes, it's really hard to understand why you shouldn't win the presidency. They didn't like direct democracy. They actually thought democracy was a scary thing because they thought the average person in the community was really not that well equipped to have good arguments, to have sufficient knowledge to be able to govern themselves. And they looked at what had happened in the states, and they saw a majority of farmers who were in debt using a very democratic system to look for relief. And they thought those farmers basically were lazy and they were squandering their resources and they didn't want to pay taxes. But if they worked a little harder and they spent less money on European luxuries, they'd be able to pay their taxes. And they weren't very sympathetic to these demands for relief. And basically, they thought a majority of, relatively poor, I don't want to say impoverished, but not affluent farmers are going to use the levers of government to redistribute wealth away from creditors and toward debtors. And that's what they thought had happened at the state level, and they wanted to ensure that wouldn't happen at the national level. Now, one mechanism for that was indirect elections. You don't have the people directly elect their government officials, but rather you have a series of indirect elections. The Electoral College system is such a mechanism for selecting the president. There were three problems with direct election, just having a national election where everybody votes for president. The first problem was they didn't trust the people to have informed views on such an important issue as choosing the nation's chief executive. Second problem was if you just had a direct election, slaves aren't going to count for anything because obviously slaves are not voters, so the southern states won't go along with that system. And the third problem was small states thought if you had a direct election, there's no chance that they would ever have the president coming from a small state. This is an era of very rudimentary communication. They didn't think it would be possible to coordinate political opinion across the country. So you'd simply have citizens in large states voting for eminent citizens from their own state, so that Virginians would end up electing the president and Delaware would never have a chance. The Electoral College system is a series of compromises, but most importantly, it is a very indirect system. So it has removed the election at least 2 degrees from popular influence. So the Constitution says state legislatures specify the mechanism for choosing the presidential elections. Today, that mechanism is direct election, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says a state legislature can't simply choose the electors itself, which is what many states did at the time, the early years of the Republic. And then the electors, they get together and they have independent deliberations. They're supposed to meet in the same day in their own states, and they have independent deliberations, and they choose whichever candidates they think would be good candidates for the chief executive. So there might be no popular involvement in this. It might be state legislatures choosing electors who then independently deliberate and decide that George Washington would be a good president or James Madison would be a good president. And that's because they did not believe the people could be trusted. So a really striking statement of that, George Mason, an important Virginia delegate at the convention, says, letting the people choose the president would be like entrusting a blind man with a choice of colors. Blind man can't choose colors, and ordinary citizens can't have informed views on who ought to be the president. Now, obviously, we don't think that anymore, but we still have the Electoral College system, which allows somebody to become president without winning a majority of the popular vote, and that's not a very sensible system.
Since it does seem like a system that's ill-suited to the present day, what would it take to change it? What mechanisms did the framers provide us to change and adapt the Constitution so that it can best serve the needs of the present?
So the only way to amend the Constitution is to go through the provisions in Article 5, and that authorizes 2 different mechanisms. One is states can petition Congress for a constitutional convention. Once 2/3 of the states have petitioned Congress, Congress is bound to call such a convention. Such a convention can then propose amendments, and those then have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The other mechanism is Congress itself decides to propose amendments, and those, again, have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Now, the Electoral College system can be amended in that way. The Senate, interestingly, can't be. So the only provision in the original Constitution that still exists and was made explicitly unamendable is the United States Senate, where the provision says each state would have to consent to being deprived of its equal representation in the Senate. And, of course, the small states will never agree to that, so that's never going to be changed by amendment. The Electoral College system can be changed. You would need to get 3/4 of the states to agree. That's 38 out of the 50 states, and 12 states that are small and benefit from the malapportionment of the Electoral College. Wyoming gets 3 electors. California gets 55 electors. That sounds like a big disparity, but it's 18-1, whereas California has between 65 and 70 times the population of Wyoming. So a citizen of Wyoming has 4 times the power as a citizen of California in electing the president. Wyoming's not going to give that up. And if you add together the 12 small states, they'll never agree to change that. The other problem is today, and there's no reason why this will always be the case, but today, the Electoral College system benefits Republicans, and that's why Trump won the presidency in 2016. It's because of the way the votes were distributed across the country, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. There's no way Republicans are going to agree today, when the system advantages them, to change it. So even though behind a kind of theoretical veil of ignorance where everybody might agree that it doesn't make a lot of sense in a system where generally majorities get to rule, that Wyoming should have 4 times the clout in picking the president that California has, we're still not going to change it because in the real world, Wyoming knows that it benefits and Republicans know that they benefit, and that makes it almost impossible to change something where you need a supermajority for change.
Mike, you've given us a whirlwind tour of the Constitution and of the inner workings of the convention that gave birth to it. And as you know, we've barely scratched the surface of the details and information in your book, The Founders' Coup. Now, before we move into the time warp, is there anything about the Constitution you think would surprise us? Or is there a question that you get quite often that you think we should know the answer to?
One thing that I found really interesting in working on the book was the extent to which ordinary, interested political bargaining is going on rather than dispassionate political philosophizing about good government. So the founding generation, the people in the Philadelphia Convention, they are a brilliant set of not particularly representative people. They're all white, they're all male, they're all pretty substantial property owners. But among that segment of the population, there's a pretty good argument that some of the best and the brightest are in Philadelphia, and many of them are quite brilliant. But they're representing their states, and they're engaged in interested bargaining. Small states want as much as they can get. Large states don't think that's fair. Southerners want as much as they can get in terms of representation for their states. Northerners think that's not fair. Particular states think the existing status quo isn't fair. New York's got this great harbor that allows it to charge New Jersey and Connecticut for imported goods that go through New York Harbor, finance the New York government on the backs of Connecticut. That's going to be taken away by the Constitution, which isn't going to allow New York to keep the revenue from its own taxes. Import taxes are going to go to the federal government. They're fighting over the sort of things that we fight over in ordinary politics. This is interested bargaining. They haven't somehow been able to distance themselves from their own interests. And I found that kind of interesting, right? Because one of the claims that, we owe deference to the Constitution, even though it was written by very different people facing different problems 225 years ago, is that there's something special about the process, that it's especially democratic or that it's especially virtuous, that somehow they've suspended their self-interest. And it actually wasn't either of those things. It wasn't that democratic because the Federalists had these built-in advantages like malapportionment and the press kind of not giving the other side a fair fight. And it wasn't that virtuous. It was basically ordinary political trucking and bargaining. And that makes it a little bit harder to understand why we ought to owe unquestioning deference to what these admittedly very wise and virtuous people did. Why should we care about their interest group bargains that were made 225 years ago? Why think that those are somehow going to be the wisest way to govern ourselves dealing with completely different issues today?
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the Philadelphia Convention to revise the Articles of Confederation had not taken place in 1787? How would the constitutional history of the United States be different today?
So obviously this requires speculation. We don't know how the counterfactual would play out. And one difficulty is that both sides had opposing incentives the Federalists had an incentive to exaggerate the dire situation facing the country because they were trying to justify radical change. And the Anti-Federalists had a corresponding inverted incentive, which was to downplay the extent to which the country was undergoing a crisis because they wanted to deny the need for radical reform. They thought just incremental reform was necessary. If you look at the private correspondence of some of the leading founders like Madison, like Hamilton, I have the sense that they really believed that there was a crisis. Congress was running out of money. There were regional divisions between East and West and North and South, and people were starting to talk about separate confederacies. If the Union had broken up into separate confederacies, there was a risk that they would always be at war with each other because if you had countries sharing common boundaries on the same landmass, the history of Europe would suggest it might be difficult for those nations not to be constantly at war with each other. If there was always this prospect of a war between a Northern Confederacy and a Southern Confederacy, you'd have to build up powerful governments because only a powerful government, perhaps with a monarch, can always be raising sufficient revenue and building armies in order to guard against war. So it might be hard to preserve Republican government. In addition, Madison and Washington believe that a lot of citizens, especially in New England, are starting to give up on the possibility of Republican government because they've just witnessed Shays' Rebellion, which scared them to death, because they think these farmers are going crazy. They're taking the law into their own hands, shutting down the courts in order to protect their farms from being foreclosed upon because they can't pay their taxes. So there is this sense that's conveyed in the correspondence, and this is private correspondence where the incentives to exaggerate are much less, maybe non-existent. There is this sense of crisis that you may get separate confederacies, that you may get civil war, that you may get people relinquishing their enthusiasm for Republican government. So I do think that it's possible. I wouldn't say certain, maybe probable, but, people could argue about exactly how probable, that things were in the process of falling apart, and if the Constitution hadn't been proposed, if it hadn't been ratified, which very nearly didn't happen, maybe things would have gotten out of control. Maybe there would have been a civil war 80 years earlier. Maybe people would have given up on their experiment in Republican government. So the what if in this situation is pretty dire and maybe plausible.
Mike, you're a historian of the Constitution, a constitutional lawyer, and you've just finished writing a big book on the Constitution. What are you researching and writing about now?
So I've pretty much been working on one book or another for the last 20 years. I wrote a big book about the Supreme Court and racial equality in American history. I wrote a couple of other books about race in American history. And then I was working for a few years on this book on the making of the Constitution. I'm taking a couple of years in which I'm going back over my constitutional history classes. I'm trying to revamp the course materials. I'm having some research assistants collect some additional materials just so I can learn more about American constitutional development, for example, from the founding to the Civil War. I kind of have two books in mind. One of them would be combining two passions I have, which are baseball and race. And I would like to write a book talking about race in American history through the lens of baseball and perhaps other sports. So why was baseball integrated but then became segregated back in the 1880s? Why did integration happen when it did happen in 1947 with Jackie Robinson? What are the incentives of various actors? Why is Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, deciding to hire black players when he did? Why does it happen first in New York City? Why is it happening right after World War II? Why, even though you got lots of African-American players in the 1950s, why were there no black managers until the 1970s? Why has the number of black players declined rapidly in the last 20 or 30 years? So I'm interested in a whole set of questions that I think might shed some light generally on how racial attitudes and practices evolve over time, but do it in a somewhat different context than talking mostly through the lens of baseball, but other sports like boxing, horse racing, where the jockeys, there were lots of black jockeys before 1900, before they got excluded from the sport until the 1960s or 1970s. And then the other book would be, I'm not sure, but I think I could write a book on constitutional development from the founding, sort of leaving off where this book finishes, through to the Civil War. Some of it would be about slavery. Some of it would be about economic development. Some of it would be about the Marshall Court and its efforts to inscribe nationalist views into the Constitution. But then the resistance shown by Jacksonian democracy, which doesn't really believe in national power, doesn't believe in a national bank, doesn't believe in the federal government imposing tariff barriers to benefit northern manufacturers. So I think those are the two projects I have in mind. But, sometimes you change your mind. Who knows what the future holds?
Do you have a website or a place we can go to look for more information about you and how we can contact you if we have any questions?
I don't have a personal website, but the Harvard Law School website, if you type in me under faculty, that's Michael Klarman, Klarman, you'll get a short biography, you'll get a CV, you'll get my email address, and I actually like to answer questions. So if somebody takes the trouble of reading my book, and that's a pretty big investment, I actually like responding to emails. So if you have questions about it or points you want to raise or things you think I should do differently in the paperback edition, I get a lot of those emails and I like to respond to them. So I encourage people to do so.
Michael Klarman, thank you so much for taking us on a whirlwind exploration of why the Constitutional Convention took place and how its delegates debated and crafted the Constitution.
Thanks very much for having me. It was fun.
At the same time the United States declared its independence from Great Britain, Congress set to work on a constitution to organize a new government. The government they crafted under the Articles of Confederation was a union of sovereign states, a union where state governments held more power than the national government. And this made a lot of sense at the time, given that states were seen as being more responsive to the needs and ideas of the people than some far-off national government. But what seemed to make sense in 1781, when the states finally finished ratifying the Articles of Confederation, did not make sense by 1787. By the late 1780s, the American economy was in a depression and war debts had to be paid. But the Confederation government stood powerless to alleviate either the economic crisis or to pay the United States' debts. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states called the shots. The states decided when it would tax the people and when it would send money to the national government, and the states decided how and when to regulate and tax trade. Many in the United States believed that something needed to be done to increase and strengthen the powers of the national government. And so, a body of delegates met in May 1787 in Philadelphia. Some came with ideas that they would revise the Articles of Confederation. Others, like James Madison, came with the ideas that they would form a completely new government. As Mike revealed, it took 3 major plans, months of debating and politicking, and lots of compromise over issues like representation, slavery, and how much direct influence ordinary Americans should have in their government before the Constitution of 1787 came to be. And unlike the government created by the Articles of Confederation, the government created by the Constitution had the power to tax, raise and maintain an army, regulate trade, and the power to ensure that its laws held supremacy over the laws of individual states. The government the framers created was much more powerful than the government under the Articles of Confederation. It was also more insulated from popular influence and intervention. Is this a good thing? As Mike noted, it depends on where you live, your political views, and the context of the day. Regardless, it's a government that has had staying power. For more than 200 years, the Constitution of 1787 has provided for the governance of the United States. Look for more information about Mike, his book, The Founder's Coup, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/143. Laurel Dane, a historian with the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, provided production assistance for this episode. Thank you for your help, Laurel. In fact, the Omohundro Institute, the place that Ben Franklin's World and I now call home, does a lot to support the early American historical scholarship that we really enjoy exploring. They support this podcast, publish books, and make digitization projects like the one underway at the Georgian Papers program possible. To discover more about the Omohundro Institute and its work with the Georgian Papers program, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Georgian Papers. Finally, what do you think about the idea that the framers of the Constitution weren't really debating political philosophy at the Constitutional Convention, but instead politicking for issues and outcomes that would benefit their home states? Does knowing this change how you think about the Constitution? Let me know. Email me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me, @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.